Hello, I'm Tom Wilkinson, and welcome to the Thinking in English podcast, a podcast aimed at intermediate to advanced level English learners. On Wednesday, the 22nd of September, the entire world will experience an equal amount of daylight and darkness. This is known as an equinox, and is celebrated by millions of people from different societies and cultures all over the world. This episode of Thinking in English will look at some of the scientific and cultural significance of the equinox, while introducing some interesting vocabulary. But first, why not follow the Thinking in English Instagram page, Thinking in English Podcast, or the link is in the description. It's full of some great vocabulary content, and you definitely should look at my blog, thinkinginenglish.blog, for all transcripts and bonus content. Here is today's vocabulary list. As always, the written list is available in the description of the podcast and also on my blog, thinkinginenglish.blog. Hemisphere. Hemisphere. A hemisphere is one of the two halves of the Earth, especially above or below the equator. As in, I live in the northern hemisphere, but my brother lives in the southern hemisphere. Astronomical. Astronomical. This adjective means connected with astronomy, which is the scientific study of the universe and of objects that exist in space, like moons and stars. For example, his house was full of strange astronomical instruments used to measure the movements of planets. Harvest. Harvest. Harvest has a few meanings. It's the time of year when crops are cut and collected from the fields, or the activity of cutting and collecting crops, or the crops that are cut and collected. For example, farmers had a good harvest this year. Tilt. Tilt. A tilt is a sloping position or an uneven position. For example, my house is built on a tilt. It's not very convenient. Axis. Axis. An axis is a real or imaginary straight line going through the center of an object that is spinning. For instance, the Earth revolves around the axis that joins the north and south poles. Glimpse. Glimpse. A glimpse is an occasion when you see something or someone for a very short time. For example, I caught a glimpse of the person who stole my car, but I can't remember his face. To persevere. To persevere. To try to do or continue something in a determined way. For instance, the team persevered and managed to win the important game. If you are listening to this podcast within the first few hours of it being released, then it is currently the autumnal, or if you speak American English, fall, equinox. On Wednesday, the 22nd of September, the entire world experienced an equal amount of daylight and darkness. If you live in the northern hemisphere like I do, this is considered to be the beginning of astronomical autumn, and daylight will continue to shorten until the winter solstice in December. However, for the listeners in the southern hemisphere, it is actually the beginning of spring, and daylight hours will get longer. Why does the autumnal equinox matter? Well, for thousands of years, cultures around the world have organized celebrations, rituals, and religious festivals around the movements of the sun and moon. The closest full moon to the equinox, known in English as the harvest moon, also has important symbolism and meaning for various peoples. The equinox also marks the changing of seasons, which is particularly important for people who live in countries far north or south of the equator. Hopefully, by the end of this episode of Thinking in English, you will know a little more about the scientific and cultural meaning to this famous event. Have you ever thought about why we have seasons? Or why the length of daylight changes throughout the year? I know I never did. Growing up in the UK, it just seemed normal for it to be dark at 4 p.m. in winter, but also normal for it to be light until 10 p.m. in the summer. It was only after living abroad in Japan, a country slightly closer to the equator, that I realized the variation in daylight hours actually changes around the world. But why does this happen? Well, there is actually one reason that the Earth has seasons, equinoxes, and solstices, and changing daylight hours. The Earth spins on a tilted axis. I assume that we all know the Earth spins, about once every 24 hours. The sun is not actually moving through the sky, but the Earth is rotating, which creates sunsets and sunrises. However, the way the Earth spins is not the same all year, as it's tilted. Some scientists believe that the tilt was caused by some massive object crashing into our planet billions of years ago. Due to the tilt, the North Pole faces the sun for half the year, and the other half of the year, the South Pole faces the sun. Twice a year, so September and March, the amount of daylight and darkness is completely balanced. However, as our atmosphere actually bends sunlight slightly, there is always a little more daylight on our planet than darkness. I already mentioned earlier in the podcast, and also in the title, that the equinox is the first day of autumn. But is it really though? Well, the answer depends on where you are and what type of scientist you ask. If you ask a meteorologist, so a scientist who studies the weather, autumn started on September the 1st. This is because, from the perspective of a meteorologist, summer is defined as the hottest 3 months of the year, so June, July, and August. Winter is the coolest months, so December, January, and February, while the months in the middle are spring and autumn. On the other hand, if you ask an astronomer, so a scientist who studies the movement of planets, stars, moons, and other things in the universe, autumn does begin today, as the northern hemisphere now receives less sunlight than the southern hemisphere. The literal definition of equinox is equal night. It is the day when day and night are completely equal, where almost the entire planet will have approximately 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of darkness. Although I mentioned earlier the atmosphere bends sunlight slightly, which means that some places will have a little extra daylight. We measure the length of day from the very first glimpse of the sun rising to the last trace of it before it falls in the sky. This can add a few extra daylight minutes. Interestingly, Earth is not the only planet in our solar system which has equinoxes. In fact, every planet spins on a tilted axis, which means they all have seasons. Some planets, like Mercury, are only tilted very slightly, while Uranus is extremely tilted. However, the further away from the sun, the less common equinoxes and solstices are. Saturn, for instance, only has an equinox once every 15 years, as it takes the planet around 29 years to orbit the sun. For thousands of years, cultures and societies around the globe have understood that equinoxes and solstices were important, and they built monuments and organized celebrations around these times of the year. Some of these festivals and traditions have persevered and are still celebrated in modern times. For example, the ancient people of the UK, known as the Celtic people, celebrated the movement of sun with a series of celebrations called sabbats. In the 1970s, an American author gave the September equinox the name Mabon, which is now used to describe this celebration in parts of the UK. Mabon is a time when pagans, paganism or pagans, is the ancient religion of the UK. So Mabon is a time when pagans celebrate the summer, take part in harvest festivals, and welcome the dark winter months. One of the ways people celebrate Mabon includes building an altar with produce like fruits and vegetables, especially apples. Other people who choose to celebrate the equinox in the UK like to gather at Stonehenge, which is an ancient monument, to watch the sunrise. Gatherings happen at Stonehenge on each equinox and solstice, so 4 times a year. However, I wouldn't say that this festival is a popular one to celebrate in the UK. It's popular with people who like to keep or to discover the ancient traditions before Christianity came to Europe. While Stonehenge is an impressive place to watch the sunrise, perhaps the best place in the world to celebrate the equinox is at the ancient Mayan pyramid of Chichen Itza in Mexico. The buildings in Chichen Itza are organized according to the movements of the sun. This is not unique to Mexico, as many ancient societies did the same thing. However, the main pyramid, called El Castillo in Spanish, is designed in such a way that at the exact moment of the equinox, an incredible shadow forms on the stairs. This shadow looks like a snake of sunlight slithering down the pyramid. In East Asia, and especially China and Chinese-influenced societies, they celebrate the September equinox as a mid-autumn festival, or the moon festival. Instead of focusing on the actual equinox, they celebrate the closest full moon. Like many other equinox festivals, the moon festival celebrates the summer harvest. In China, people celebrate by giving friends and family mooncakes, a pastry with fillings such as sesame seeds, duck eggs, or dried fruit inside. Mooncakes are actually an ancient snack, with early versions dating back 3,000 years. Also in East Asia, Japan has a Buddhist festival called Higan, which is celebrated at both of the equinoxes. Japanese Buddhists believe the afterlife is located in the west, which is exactly where the sun sets during the equinox. It is a time to remember the dead by visiting, cleaning, and decorating their graves, and also to meditate and visit relatives. There is one global festival that takes place close to the September equinox, the Christian festival of Michaelmas, also known as the Feast of Michael and All Angels. Although this is not a major festival, it is still celebrated by some Catholic churches. The reason I mentioned it, however, is that it is typical of many Christian festivals. Christian festivals tend to be at similar times to solstices, equinoxes, and other traditional pagan celebrations. Why? Well, some scholars believe that it was a method to attract pagan Europeans and to make it easier to convert to Christianity 2,000 years ago. Think about it. Christmas is close to the winter solstice. Easter, the spring equinox. Halloween is also close to Christian festivals. These are not the only celebrations around the world. In Lithuania, people light candles during autumn equinox. In Poland, people get food blessed by priests. Hindu people in India celebrate Navratri, a festival that lasts over several days. I've probably missed some festivals around the world. So if your country or your culture celebrates the equinox in some way, please reach out on Instagram and let me know. So here is today's final thought. This episode of Thinking in English has looked at the autumnal equinox. I talked about what an equinox is. I discussed the science behind the spectacle, before finally introducing some of the various festivals that take place around the world. Have you heard of any other fascinating September equinox celebrations? Or do you celebrate the September equinox in a special way? Reach out on Instagram and let me know. Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed it, please leave a review or rating, recommend it to your friends, or let me know on Instagram. My Instagram is thinkinginenglishpod. The link should be in the description. And make sure you check out the Thinking in English blog. I love hearing from listeners, and I really appreciate all of the messages I have received over the past few months. Feel free to send me a message or give me some advice or recommend a topic. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.